Before Britain ruled the world, it was just a small island on the edge of Europe, divided, vulnerable, and often invaded. No one, not even its own people, imagined that this land would one day control nearly a quarter of the earth. The story of the British Empire does not begin with power. It begins with survival. In the late medieval period, England was struggling. It faced internal conflict, weak royal authority, and constant threats from stronger European neighbors like France and Spain. But geography became Britain's first advantage. Being an island meant protection. While Europe burned in endless land wars, Britain slowly learned to look outward, to the sea. Everything changed in the 15th and 16th centuries. The age of exploration had begun. Spain and Portugal were discovering new lands and unimaginable wealth across the oceans. Britain arrived late to this race, but when it arrived, it came prepared to learn, adapt, and dominate. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 was a turning point. Spain was the world's greatest naval power, and its failure against England sent a powerful message. Britain could defend itself at sea. From this moment onward, the ocean became Britain's highway to power. Trade came before conquest. British merchants began sailing to Asia, Africa, and the Americas, not as conquerors, but as traders. The founding of the East India Company in 1600 marked a historic shift. It was not a government, but a private company backed by royal power, seeking profit across the globe. This combination, commerce, navy, and political ambition, would become the core engine of the British Empire. Colonies soon followed. In North America and the Caribbean, Britain established settlements. Some failed. Many suffered. Indigenous populations were displaced, enslaved, or wiped out by disease. African slavery became central to Britain's growing wealth, especially through sugar plantations in the Caribbean. By the early 18th century, Britain was no longer just trading overseas. It was ruling overseas. But power did not come easily. Britain fought constant wars with France, the Netherlands, and rival empires, each conflict expanding British territory while strengthening its navy. Victory at sea became Britain's signature. Whoever controlled the oceans controlled trade, and whoever controlled trade controlled wealth. By 1750, Britain had laid the foundations of a global empire. It was not yet the largest, but it was rising faster than any other power in history, and the world was about to feel its full force. The British Empire did not explode into dominance overnight. It expanded piece by piece, war by war, port by port, until suddenly it was everywhere. The Industrial Revolution changed everything. Britain became the first industrial nation in the world. Factories replaced farms. Machines replaced manual labor. Coal, steam engines, and mass production transformed the economy. But industry needed raw materials and markets to sell finished goods. The empire became the solution. India was the crown jewel. What began as trade posts turned into political control. After the Battle of Plassey in 1757, the East India Company effectively ruled vast regions of India. British officials collected taxes, controlled armies, and reshaped economies to serve British factories back home. India was not governed for Indians. It was governed for British profit. Textile industries were destroyed. Resources were extracted. Famine followed policies that prioritized exports over survival. Millions suffered while Britain grew richer. At the same time, Britain expanded into Africa, Southeast Asia, Australia, and the Middle East. Ports became colonies. Colonies became administrative states. Railways, courts, and English education were introduced, but always under British control. This era gave birth to the phrase, the empire on which the sun never sets. At its peak, Britain ruled 1/4 of the world's population, nearly 1/4 of the planet's land surface. London became the center of global finance. The British pound became the world's most trusted currency. British ships dominated international trade routes. But beneath this power lay deep contradictions. The empire claimed to bring civilization, but relied on force. It promised order, but created division. It spoke of progress, while extracting wealth at enormous human cost. Resistance began to grow. In America, Britain lost its colonies after the American Revolution. In India, uprisings like the Revolt of 1857 exposed the fragility of British control. Across Africa and Asia, anti-colonial movements slowly took shape. Still, Britain stood at the peak of global power in the 19th century. But empires do not fall because they are weak. They fall because they become too large to control. And Britain was approaching that moment. By the late 19th century, the British Empire had reached a scale the world had never seen before. Red covered the map. From Canada to India, from Australia to Africa, British authority stretched across continents, oceans, and cultures that had nothing in common, except one thing. They were all ruled from London. Queen Victoria became the symbol of this age. Under her reign, Britain presented itself as the moral leader of the world. Railways, telegraphs, English law, and Western education spread rapidly through the colonies. To many in Britain, this was proof that the empire was a force for good. But power at this scale came at a cost. The empire was now too large, too complex, and too dependent on constant control. Maintaining order required armies, administrators, and money, vast amounts of it. Any disruption anywhere in the empire sent shockwaves across the system. Colonial resentment grew quietly but steadily. In India, British policies drained wealth and ignored local needs. In Ireland, famine and political repression left deep scars. In Africa, borders were drawn with no regard for tribes or history, planting the seeds of future conflict. Britain ruled, but it was no longer respected everywhere. Then came the wars. The Boer War exposed how difficult it had become to control distant territories. British forces struggled against smaller, determined opponents. The myth of invincibility began to crack. And while Britain was focused on its empire, the world was changing. Germany, the United States, and Japan were rising industrial powers. They had factories, armies, and ambitions. Britain was still powerful, but it was no longer alone at the top. The empire had reached its greatest height, but it was standing on unstable ground. The first blow came in 1914. World War I was not just a European conflict. It was an imperial war. Soldiers from India, Africa, Canada, Australia, and the Caribbean were sent to fight for Britain. Millions answered the call. Hundreds of thousands never returned. Britain survived the war, but at a terrible cost. The economy was shattered. Debt soared. The empire was exhausted. And something far more dangerous had begun to spread across the colonies. The idea that Britain was not invincible. World War II delivered the final shock. Once again, Britain fought for survival. Once again, the empire was mobilized. But this time, the war exposed Britain's dependence on others, especially the United States. By 1945, Britain had won the war, but lost its position as the world's leading power. The illusion of empire could no longer be maintained. Colonies demanded independence, and now Britain lacked the strength, money, and moral authority to stop them. India gained independence in 1947, followed by Pakistan. Across Africa and Asia, nations broke free one by one. Some transitions were peaceful, others were violent and chaotic. The empire collapsed not in one dramatic moment, but in a long, unavoidable retreat. By the late 20th century, the British Empire had effectively ended. What remained was not an empire, but a legacy. English became a global language. British legal systems influenced modern governments. Trade networks reshaped economies. And unresolved borders, conflicts, and inequalities continued to affect former colonies. The empire that once ruled the world had disappeared, but its impact never did. The British Empire did not end with a single collapse, a final battle, or a declaration of defeat. It faded, slowly, unevenly, and often painfully. By the time the last colonies gained independence, Britain was no longer trying to rule the world. Instead, it was trying to understand what the world had become without its empire. Yet even after the empire disappeared from maps, it remained deeply embedded in modern life. More than a quarter of the world's population lives in countries once ruled by Britain. English remains the global language of business, aviation, science, and the internet. Parliamentary systems, common law, and administrative structures, introduced during imperial rule, still shape governments across continents. But this legacy is not simple, and it is not neutral. Alongside railways and legal systems came exploitation, cultural destruction, economic imbalance, and borders drawn without consent. Many modern conflicts can be traced directly back to decisions made during imperial rule. Wealth flowed outward from the colonies, while long-term consequences remained behind. For Britain itself, The empire left a complicated inheritance. It brought prestige, power, and global influence, but also dependency on imperial wealth and labor. When the empire vanished, Britain faced a new identity crisis. A nation that once ruled the world, now forced to find its place within it. The rise and fall of the British Empire is not just a story of conquest and decline. It is a story of ambition without limits, of power stretched too far, of control gained and ultimately lost. And most importantly, it is a reminder that no empire, no matter how vast, no matter how powerful, is permanent. History does not belong to those who rule the longest. It belongs to those who learn from what came before. And the shadow of the British Empire, both its achievements and its consequences, still stretches across the modern world today.